At 60, they saw a relic, a ghost from past war. They stripped the decorated veteran of her rifle, cornering her with 5 young soldiers. They thought it was an execution. They were profoundly wrong. Master Sergeant Evelyn Reed felt the trap before she saw it. The air in the corridor leading to conference room 3 was too still, the silence too deliberate. At 60 years old, with a career forged in the crucible of the Gulf War, Eve's instincts were more reliable than any modern threat detection system. The summons from Colonel Marcus Thorne had been vague, a mandatory capability assessment, but the undertone was clear. Change was coming, and Thorne was the kind of man who used change like a weapon. She pushed open the heavy door. The room wasn't the familiar, worn-out space she was used to. It was a testament to Thorne's vision of a new-age military. A massive, glossy black table dominated the center, surrounded by minimalist chrome chairs. A 90-inch flat-screen monitor hummed silently on the far wall, casting a cold, bluish light. It was a room designed for corporate-style efficiency, not for soldiers. And in that room, the ambush was waiting. 5 men, none of them a day over 25, formed a loose, intimidating semicircle. They were specimens of modern military fitness, their muscles straining against the fabric of their combat uniforms. Eve's eyes, trained to assess threats in fractions of a second, cataloged them instantly. There was Sergeant Titan Davies, a CrossFit fanatic whose neck was as thick as her waist. Corporal Jensen, shorter but coiled with the dense muscle of a Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner. Specialist O'Connell, a former college football player whose swagger screamed overconfidence. The other 2 were quieter, but no less dangerous. One moved with the telltale balance of a trained martial artist. The other simply radiated raw, undisciplined aggression. Colonel Thorne stood apart from them, leaning against the wall with a self-satisfied smirk. He was a man in his late 40s, handsome in a severe way, with a reputation for ruthless modernization. To him, anything that smacked of the old ways was a liability. Master Sergeant Reed, Thorne began, his voice smooth but laced with condescension. Thank you for joining us. Please have a seat. Eve remained standing, her posture relaxed but rooted to the floor. I prefer to stand, sir. What is this about? Straight to the point. I admire that, Thorne said, though his eyes told a different story. It's about ensuring our senior assets are still operationally viable. We have to be sure you can still keep up with the pace of a modern unit. Eve, this isn't your era's war anymore. The Aegis barb landed exactly as intended. Eve thought of the sandstorms in Kuwait, the tension in the streets of Baghdad, the lives she'd saved with skill and nerve, not youthful exuberance. Every commendation she'd ever earned felt like it was being questioned not for its merit, but for its date of issue. My record is current and speaks for itself, Colonel. Records can be misleading, Thorne countered, pushing off the wall and beginning to circle her like a shark. What matters is tangible, real-world effectiveness. These men, he gestured to the 5 soldiers, who shifted their weight in unison, have expressed concerns. They believe your traditional methods might not hold up under pressure against actual, determined opponents. It was a lie, and they all knew it. These young soldiers hadn't expressed concerns. They'd been given orders. This was a pre-orchestrated piece of theater designed for one purpose: her humiliation. And what are you proposing, sir? Eve asked, her voice dangerously calm. A simple demonstration, Thorne announced, his smile widening. A controlled sparring exercise. Hand-to-hand only. You against these 5. A simple test to assess your readiness for continued deployment in a high-intensity training role. Titan Davies cracked his knuckles, the sound echoing in the sterile room. Don't worry, Master Sergeant, he grinned. We'll take it easy on you. The condescension was a physical force, but Eve converted it to fuel. There was one final piece to Thorne's trap, and she knew what it was before he said it. Of course, to ensure a fair assessment, with no equipment advantages, Thorne continued, his eyes locking onto the rifle slung over her shoulder. You'll need to surrender all your gear, your sidearm, your tactical vest, and your rifle. He was talking about her M21. Not just a weapon, but a part of her soul. It was a relic like her, but it was a relic that had delivered precision and justice for over 30 years. He wanted to strip her of everything that defined her, leaving only a 60-year-old woman to be broken by 5 men in their physical prime. Sir, that hardly seems like a fair test of a soldier's combat effectiveness. Thorne's mask of civility finally dropped. Those are the terms. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to request a transfer to a more suitable position. Logistics, perhaps? Administration? The threat was unveiled. Submit to this public execution or be shuffled off into a meaningless retirement. Eve looked at the 5 young faces, brimming with a dangerous mix of arrogance and orders. She looked at Thorne, his victory already gleaming in his eyes. Then she looked down at her M21. Slowly, deliberately, she unslung the rifle. The worn metal was cool against her hands. She placed it on the gleaming black table with a soft, reverent click. Then came the sidearm, the tactical vest. Each piece of gear hitting the table was a layer of her authority, her history being stripped away. But as the pile of equipment grew, something else was building inside her. A cold, quiet fury. A focus so intense it felt like the world was slowing down. She stood before them in nothing but her simple BDU pants and a t-shirt. She looked smaller, older, more vulnerable. It was exactly what she wanted. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice a low whisper that cut through the tension. "I hope you're ready." As Eve stood in the center of the room, the transformation was palpable. The space no longer felt like a conference room. It had become a gladiatorial pit. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, casting long, predatory shadows. For a moment, she allowed the 5 soldiers and Colonel Thorne to see what they expected. A 60-year-old woman, outmatched and out of her depth. Her breathing was slow, her posture deceptively relaxed. But behind her calm, gray eyes, a supercomputer of combat experience was running at full capacity. Her mind wasn't filled with anger or fear, but with cold, hard numbers. At 5'6" and 140 pounds, she was giving up an average of 70 pounds and a foot in height to each opponent. Combined, they outweighed her by close to 350 pounds. A conventional analysis would label this an unwinnable scenario. But Eve's entire career had been built on defying conventional analysis. She began her assessment, her gaze moving from man to man, not as a victim, but as a predator identifying weaknesses in the herd. First, Sergeant Titan Davies. He was bouncing on the balls of his feet, a restless bull eager for the charge. 6'4", 240 pounds of pure, CrossFit sculpted muscle. He was all power, but it was inefficient power. Eve saw how his overdeveloped shoulders and chest limited his rotational movement. He was a straight-line attacker, a freight train. And freight trains, she recalled from a lesson learned in the narrow alleys of Baghdad, are remarkably easy to derail if you know precisely where to apply pressure. Next, Corporal Jensen, the BJJ specialist. He was already in a low, wide stance, his center of gravity anchored, built for grappling, for controlling an opponent on ground. But ground fighting required closing the distance. It required getting a grip. Eve watched his eyes. They weren't focused on her face or hands, but on her hips and legs, constantly calculating the angle for a takedown. He was playing his game, not adapting to hers. That was his mistake. She had no intention of letting him get close enough to play. Then, Specialist O'Connell, the former football player. He carried himself with an athlete's confidence, understanding angles and momentum. But Eve saw the ghost of an old injury in the way he favored his left knee. More importantly, she saw the simmering rage in his eyes. He wasn't just here to follow orders. He was here to prove something, to unleash some personal frustration. Angry fighters her first hand-to-hand instructor had taught her were predictable fighters. They sacrificed strategy for satisfaction. The fourth, the quiet martial artist, was more disciplined. He stood with his hands open and loose, his weight perfectly balanced. He was watching her breathing, trying to anticipate her rhythm. He was a technician, but his style, she recognized from its rigid forms, was built on patterns and preset combinations. He expected a certain kind of fight, a duel of techniques. Eve planned to give him chaos instead. Finally, the fifth man, the one who radiated raw aggression. He was a brawler, pure and simple. His fists were already clenched, his jaw tight. He would be all wild haymakers and clumsy charges. He was the least skilled, but in some ways the most dangerous, because his unpredictability could disrupt a more calculated fighter. He would be a tool to be used against the others. As she processed this data, Eve's right hand drifted, as if by accident, and her thumb brushed against a thin, silvery scar on the inside of her left wrist. It was a memento from a close call in a Kuwaiti marketplace, a knife fight that had taught her a brutal lesson about the vulnerability of the human hand. It was a lesson she was about to teach. Colonel Thorne, seeing her apparent inaction as fear, cleared his throat officiously. He pulled out his phone, the screen's glow illuminating his smug face. "This will be recorded for training and evaluation purposes, of course," he announced to the room. He was already building his narrative. If she lost, the video would be a cautionary tale. If she won, a possibility he clearly found absurd, he would claim his men were holding back. "You have 90 seconds, gentlemen," Thorne declared, his voice booming with theatrical authority. "Demonstrate appropriate force application. Master Sergeant Reed, you have the same amount of time to validate your service record." He'd given her 90 seconds, a generous time limit, likely intended to ensure she was thoroughly exhausted and overwhelmed. Eve allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch her lips. 90 seconds was an eternity. She would need half of that. She shifted her weight, settling into a stance her father, a boxer, had taught her half a century ago. It was relaxed, open, inviting. It looked like no formal fighting stance any of them had ever seen. It looked weak. The five men tensed, ready to spring. The air crackled with anticipation. Colonel Thorne raised his hand. Time seemed to stretch, each microsecond a universe of possibility. Eve took one final, deep breath, the familiar calm of the storm's ice settling over her. She had spent a lifetime being underestimated. It was time to collect on that investment. Colonel Thorne's hand sliced down. The timer on his phone began its silent, relentless countdown from 90:00. The room exploded. Titan Davies charged first, just as Eve knew he would. All 240 pounds of him came at her like a battering ram, his face a mask of grim determination. His plan was simple: overwhelm her with sheer mass, end it in one brutal collision, and get back to the gym. He was a force of nature. But Eve had spent her life studying forces of nature, from desert sandstorms to human ambition, and she knew they all had patterns. As Titan closed the final few feet, his arms outstretched for a crushing bear hug, Eve vanished. It wasn't a feat of impossible speed. It was a simple, elegant lesson in physics, taught to her by a tiny, elderly Aikido master when she was a teenager. She didn't step back. She pivoted on the ball of her left foot, turning her body 90 degrees. Titan's massive momentum, now unchecked, carried him hurtling past her. But she wasn't just evading. As he passed, her right hand shot out, not in a strike but with an open palm. She didn't hit his back. She guided it, adding the slightest bit of rotational force to his already off-balance charge. Simultaneously, her right leg swept his trailing ankle. The effect was spectacular. Titan, the immovable object, was suddenly airborne. He crashed into the high-tech conference room's water dispenser with a sound like a car wreck. The plastic shattered, sending a cascade of water and ice across the floor. He landed in a heap, the air driven from his lungs in a shocked gasp. The timer read 78:43, 11 and a half seconds down. For opponents to go. The crash was the starting gun for the others. O'Connell, the football player, and Jensen, the BJJ expert, attacked at once from opposite sides, a classic pincer movement designed to negate her mobility. It was a sound strategy, but they were executing it against the wrong opponent. Eve didn't retreat. She dropped, her body coiled into a low crouch, making her a smaller, more difficult target. O'Connell, coming from her right, threw a wild, telegraphed right hook that would have taken her head off. But she was already moving, flowing underneath the arc of his swing. She came up inside his guard, a space he thought was safe. Her left hand shot up, fingers held stiffly together like a spear. She didn't aim for his face or chest. She struck the cluster of nerves on the inside of his bicep. It was a small target, a move requiring surgical precision. The impact was barely audible, but O'Connell screamed, his entire arm going numb and useless as if struck by lightning. He staggered back, clutching the dead limb in confusion and agony. As she dealt with O'Connell, Jensen was lunging from her left, going for the double-leg takedown he'd been planning from the start. His form was perfect. Against any other opponent, it would have been the end of the fight. But Eve had been waiting for it. As he committed, she didn't try to sprawl or push him away. She met his lunge. Her right hand clamped down on the back of his neck, while her left hand, the one with the scarred wrist, shot under his armpit and grabbed a fistful of his uniform. Using his own forward momentum, she pivoted hard, a modified hip toss that was pure, brutal judo. Jensen, for all his strength, was suddenly weightless. He flew over her hip and slammed onto his back, his head hitting the floor with a sickening thud that knocked the wind and the fight out of him. The timer showed 68:19. 22 seconds elapsed. 3 down. The two remaining fighters, the martial artist and the brawler, hesitated for a fatal second, their confidence shattered by the impossible scene before them. The martial artist was the first to recover, launching a textbook-perfect spinning back kick aimed at her midsection. It was fast, powerful, and beautiful to watch. It was also completely predictable. Eve swayed back just enough for the kick to whistle past her face, so close she could feel the breeze. Before his foot even touched the ground, she stepped in, closing the distance. She wasn't attacking his body. She grabbed his extended kicking leg with both hands, lifted, and pushed. With his balance gone, he hopped backward on one foot before crashing unceremoniously into the legs of the conference table. The timer read 59:92. 30 seconds down. Now, only the brawler remained. Seeing his comrades defeated, his discipline evaporated, replaced by pure rage. He bellowed and charged, swinging his fists like clumsy clubs. This, Eve knew, was the most dangerous moment. A wild, desperate opponent was an unpredictable one, so she didn't engage him directly. As he swung a haymaker, she ducked under it and moved past him toward the wreckage of the water dispenser. She scooped up a handful of ice cubes from the floor. He turned and came at her again. This time, as he lunged, she threw the ice cubes directly into his face. It was a playground tactic, utterly devoid of honor or technique, and it was devastatingly effective. The brawler flinched, his eyes squeezed shut from the shock and the cold. For a single, crucial second, he was blind. In that second, Eve struck. A single, precise knife hand chopped to the side of his neck, targeting the vagus nerve. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. Unconscious. The timer showed 51:17. The fight had taken 38.83 seconds. But Eve wasn't finished. She looked at O'Connell, who was still cradling his numb arm. She looked at the martial artist tangled in the chairs. She looked at Titan, who was just beginning to stir. The timer read 47:00. Slowly, deliberately, she walked over to the main conference table. She picked up a single, heavy-duty metal stapler. She looked directly at Colonel Thorne, whose face was a pale mask of disbelief. The timer read 45:00. She held up the stapler. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "The demonstration isn't scheduled to end for another 45 seconds. Would you like to be my sixth opponent?" The silence that followed Eve's question was absolute. It was heavier than the groans of the defeated soldiers, louder than the frantic, unheard countdown on Colonel Thorne's phone, which now lay forgotten on the floor where he dropped it. For 17 seconds, Eve counted them. The only movement in the room was the slow drip of water from the shattered dispenser. Then, a sound broke the spell. It was laughter. Sergeant Titan Davies, sitting amidst the wreckage, threw his head back and let out a wheezing, incredulous laugh. It wasn't cruel or mocking, but the sound of a man whose entire worldview had just been dismantled by a 140-pound woman old enough to be his mother. "Holy," he gasped, shaking his head. "I just got taken out by someone who weighs less than my Sunday brunch." "Ma'am, where in God's name did you learn to fight like that?" Eve placed the stapler back on the table with a decisive click. She walked over to the unconscious brawler, knelt, and checked his pulse and breathing. Satisfied he was stable, she answered Titan without looking at him. "My father taught me how to take a punch when I was 12. An Aikido master taught me how to avoid one when I was 15. The United States Army taught me how to end a fight. But I learned the most important lessons," she said, finally turning to look at the 5 broken men, "from people who genuinely wanted to kill me. They were far more motivated instructors than you gentlemen." Corporal Jensen, the BJJ expert, had pushed himself into a sitting position, his face a mixture of pain and awe. "That throw. I've competed all over the country. No one's ever done that to me. It was flawless. It's a modified Koshi Guruma," Eve explained, her tone shifting from combatant to instructor. "You were so focused on getting me to the ground, you forgot to protect your own center of gravity. Different objectives, different techniques." She moved to O'Connell, the football player, and pointed to his still tingling arm. "You led with your ego, specialist. You threw a knockout punch when a simple jab would have been smarter. Your anger made you predictable." Each word was a clinical diagnosis of their failure. She wasn't rubbing it in. She was teaching. She was doing the very job Thorne had claimed she was unfit for. This wasn't just a victory, it was an audit. The door to the conference room creaked open. A few curious faces had become a crowd of silent onlookers, soldiers who had been drawn by the sounds of the brief, one-sided battle. Their whispers created a low, buzzing hum of disbelief. The legend was already being born. Colonel Thorne finally found his voice, a strangled croak. This is impossible. You're 60 years old. They outweigh you by nearly 400 pounds. "Yes, sir," Eve said, her tone respectful but her eyes hard as flint. "But mass is only an advantage if you can bring it to bear. Speed, leverage, and timing will defeat size every time. My father used to say a hornet doesn't need to be bigger than a bear to ruin its day." Thorne opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. His authority had evaporated. He was no longer the commander in this room. He was just a spectator at his own public execution. The power dynamic had been irrevocably flipped. He had set a trap for a rabbit and discovered, too late, that he had cornered a wolf. The 5 young lions he had sicked on her were now looking at her not as a victim, but as the alpha. The respect in their eyes was real, earned in seconds of brutal, undeniable truth. The fear in Thorne's eyes was just as real. He hadn't just lost an argument. He had lost control, and in the military, that was everything. Just as Thorne was struggling to reassemble his shattered composure, the conference room door swung open fully. It wasn't a curious soldier this time. It was Captain Eva Rostova, the base's public affairs officer, and she was holding her phone up, its camera lens a cold, unblinking eye. "Master Sergeant Reed," Rostova said, her voice crisp and professional, though a flicker of admiration danced in her eyes. "I think you need to know that this entire evaluation was live-streamed." Eve's heart sank for a fraction of a second. She had won the physical battle, but a viral video was a war on a different front, one fought with narratives and spin. "It started on a private group chat," Rostova continued, her eyes briefly flicking toward Thorne with disdain. "But someone share the link. It's been viewed over 100,000 times in the last 10 minutes. The hashtag Grandma Soldier is trending." Before Eve could process this, the massive monitor on the wall, which had been displaying a generic army logo, blinked and came to life. The face that appeared was that of 3-star General Ramirez, a formidable woman who oversaw the entire Western Command. Her expression was granite. "Colonel Thorne," the general's voice boomed from the speakers, sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm watching a video that appears to show you orchestrating a 5-on-1 assault against a decorated Master Sergeant. Explain yourself. Now." The color drained from Thorne's face. "General, this was a regulated fitness assessment." "An assessment?" Ramirez's voice dripped with ice. It looks like a back-alley mugging with government-issue uniforms. I have the Secretary of Defense's office on my other line, Colonel. They are also enjoying your video. Your command is hereby suspended, pending a full Inspector General investigation into your evaluation practices and potential conduct unbecoming of an officer. The General's gaze then shifted, softening almost imperceptibly as she addressed Eve. Master Sergeant Reed, stand by. My office will be in contact within the hour. And from what I just witnessed, I'd say your combat effectiveness is more than validated. The screen went black. The room was left in a state of suspended animation. The institutional hammer had fallen with breathtaking speed. Captain Rostova lowered her phone, a small, triumphant smile on her face. My phone hasn't stopped ringing, Master Sergeant. CNN, Fox News, the Pentagon Channel, they all want an interview. The implications began to cascade through Eve's mind. This was no longer about her career. The video of a 60-year-old woman systematically and intelligently dismantling 5 younger, stronger male soldiers was a cultural bombshell. It was a direct, visual refutation of ageism and sexism in one of the world's most physically demanding professions. The live stream comments, which Rostova briefly showed her, were a chaotic mix of disbelief, hero worship, and debate. That CGI has to be, my grandpa is 60 and needs help with his groceries. This woman is a machine. This is what happens when technique meets testosterone. Technique wins. Hashtag the Reed Doctrine. Amidst the chaos, something remarkable happened. Corporal Jensen, the BJJ expert, struggled to his feet and approached Eve, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of pure respect. Ma'am, he said, his voice humbled. I've spent thousands of hours on the mats. I thought I understood leverage. What you did, would you be willing to teach me? One by one, the other 4 soldiers followed suit. Their arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate hunger for knowledge. They had entered the room to enforce a bias. They were now begging to learn from the woman who had shattered it. 6 weeks later, the dust had settled, but the landscape had been permanently altered. Colonel Thorne was quietly reassigned to a desk job in the Aleutian Islands, a bureaucratic exile from which his career would never recover. Master Sergeant Evelyn Reed, on the other hand, was given a promotion and a new, unprecedented role, director of the newly formed Advanced Combat Tactics Program. Her first 5 students were the very men she had defeated. Titan, Jensen, O'Connell, and the others became her core cadre, helping her deconstruct the principles she had demonstrated in that conference room. Together, they built a new curriculum from the ground up. It was officially named the Asymmetrical Combat Engagement Program, but everyone on base called it the Reed Doctrine. Its core tenets were simple: technique over tonnage, speed over strength, intelligence over aggression. It emphasized using an opponent's advantages, their size, their anger, their overconfidence, against them. Within a year, it was being adopted by special forces units across the globe. But Eve's true legacy wasn't defined by a training manual or a new title. It was defined in a moment during her first official training session. A young female recruit, barely 20 years old and no bigger than Eve had been at that age, approached her nervously after the class. Master Sergeant, the recruit began, her voice barely a whisper. I saw the video. Everyone in my life, even my drill sergeants, told me I was too small, that I didn't have the strength to be an effective soldier. But after watching you, she trailed off, her eyes shining with a hope that was brighter than any medal. I want to learn everything you can teach me. Eve looked at the young woman and saw a reflection of her own past, a mirror of every doubt she had ever faced and conquered. She placed a hand on the recruit's shoulder, her grip firm and reassuring. Kid, remember this, Eve said, her voice resonating with the quiet power of hard-won wisdom. They only see your shell. They measure your height and your weight. But your real weapons are your mind and your heart. Forge them into steel. Make them unbreakable, and you will be unstoppable. The story of the 83-second fight became a legend, a modern military myth told in barracks and training halls around the world. But for Eve, the victory wasn't in the 5 men she floored or the career she saved. It was in the countless soldiers, men and women, who would come after her, now armed with the undeniable proof that the most powerful weapon a warrior can carry is the belief that they are more than what others see. Evelyn Reed's story proved that true strength is ageless. What quality do you think is most important in adversity? Share your thoughts in a respectful discussion below. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible true stories that break the mold. #CommentRespect.